to you because I'm asking about your specific action in 2020 and also what you will do in 2024. Do you still think that Trump won the election in 2020, and will you accept the results in 2024, Senator?
All right, let's take each of those questions. You asked, do I still think Trump won the election in 2020? I've never said that. What I've said is we had an election, we had a contested election. No, I've never said that. You can go back and look. I've never said that once. What I've said, I did object. And as you know, I gave a speech on the Senate floor when I objected. And what I objected for, look, this is something I wrote about in a book I wrote called Justice Corrupted, How the Left Has Weaponized the Legal System. And I have an entire chapter in that book. It happens to be chapter 6. It's on January 6th, explaining what happened. And I go into the backdrop of that. Right after the election in November 2020, we saw in 2020, we saw a number of states using the excuse of COVID change their election laws and change the election laws in a way that dramatically increased the risks of voter fraud. They moved to things like universal mail-in balloting. They moved to things like allowing ballot harvesting. They moved to things like unattended ballot drop boxes. Every one of those are practices that significantly increase the risk of voter fraud. I think that was a very cynical effort by Democrats to take advantage of the pandemic to gain political advantage. Now, there were many allegations of voter fraud across the country coming out of that election. I struggled with, and I write about this at length in the book, I struggled with in November and December what the right response for Congress was in that circumstance. And the reason is I had two choices on January 6th. I either had to vote. We were going to have an objection to the election, so I either had to vote in favor of the objection or against the objection. And here was my dilemma. If I voted against the objection, that would be heard and understood by millions of Americans as my saying I thought voter fraud wasn't real, it didn't matter, it was not something we should be concerned with. And that's false. That's not what I believed. But the problem was if I voted to certify, it was saying that's if I voted to certify. If I voted not to certify, though, it is an utterly unprincipled position to say, well, my guy didn't win, so I'm not going to certify the election. I was not willing to do that. I believe in democracy. I believe in elections. And so simply sour grapes of saying the candidate I wanted to win didn't win, so I'm a no, that's unprincipled. And so both of the choices I had, I thought were terrible. As you know, before I was in the Senate, what I did for a living, I was a Supreme Court litigator. I argued cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Supreme Court litigators, what you often do is you look to history and you look to precedent. And so I began researching and saying, well, has Congress ever faced this before? We have a country that's been around over 200 years. We ever faced this before? And as I looked at that, I began looking at the election of 1876, and I thought the election of 1876 was very relevant. That was the election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And in that election, just like in 2020, there were very serious allegations of voter fraud in multiple states. And when it came to Congress, what did Congress do in 1876? It didn't throw its hands up and say, oh, we're powerless to do anything about it. We have to ignore the allegations of voter fraud. No, instead, what Congress did is it appointed an election commission. It consisted of 15 members, 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices. They examined the evidence, made a determination, and that resolved the election. So I proposed in 2020 we do the same thing. I think that was the best